Okay, I started it. Just give me 2 seconds to make sure it pops up on YouTube here. Oh. All right, there we go. Awesome. So I'm back with Scott Ritter. Scott, thank you for being here. It's a pleasure as always. I figured we'd jump right into it and start with the dirty bomb news. I know you've talked about it a lot over the last couple of days, but just yesterday we got a report from RIA Novosti. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's a Russian media outlet. And they claim that Ukraine is planning to put a dirty bomb on a Tonka U missile that they're going to try to disguise as an Iskandar, so that they then plan to fire it over Chernobyl and shoot it down and blame it on Russia. And of course, say that Russia, launched some type of nuclear device towards Ukraine. Do you believe that report? Do you think that's likely? What are your thoughts on that?
Look, to a layperson, maybe that sounds, maybe a Tom Clancy novel could include something like this. Nobody will ever confuse a Tochka U missile with an Iskander. They're two different missiles. It just doesn't work that way. Normally Russia wouldn't release intelligence information about the detection of launch and the radar tracking of launch. Because that's a sensitive military secret. But in something like this, Russia could easily show proof that the missile was fired from Ukraine. The point of origin was in Ukraine. No rational person who is knowledgeable of Russian intelligence capabilities, the difference between a Tochka and an Iskander, would ever believe this. The ignorant mainstream media would, of course, run with this story, publish it. But I can guarantee you there would be nobody in the National Security Council who would be telling Joe Biden, yeah, we got to act on this one. This is good stuff. No, they won't do that. Especially when look, in Syria, they went along with some stupid stuff. They use sarin nerve agent, and they're collecting. Oh, that guy's barefoot, and the other guy's using no gloves. But that's okay. Nobody will pick up on it because it's just Syria. There's no consequences for the lie. This is Russia. The consequences of engaging Russia militarily in Ukraine is the termination of life on the planet. So I think that the normal, the usual suspects in terms of ginning up false flags and things. They're not at play here. They don't get to play at this game. They get to play the Little League game. They get to play Pop Warner. We're talking about the NFL. We're talking about the Super Bowl, and they're not even invited into the stadium. So, no, this isn't going to happen. It's a stupid idea. People 20 times smarter than me, and there's a whole bunch of them, would take this thing apart in a heartbeat. The Russians would have the definitive proof that it wasn't what the Ukrainians said it was. So, no, I read the story, I looked at it, and I went, this, not even Tom Clancy would run this. You read The Hunt for Red October, he respected, reality. He wrote a very realistic novel based upon what submarines really could do as opposed to, fantasy. This is fantasy, and it's bad fantasy. It's the kind of stupidity that belongs in a $1, cheap novel. It doesn't belong on the table in front of serious people.
You reminded me of one thing when you mentioned Syria. I remember, I forget if it was a CNN reporter or an MSNBC reporter, but they were over there after the, sarin gas attack that they said happened. And one of the reporters, she picks up a cloth off the ground that she says was exposed to sarin gas, no gloves or anything. She picks it up and she smells it. And she goes like, "Oh wow, it smells so bad." So she's claiming there's a nerve agent, but yet she can smell it. And she's fine. I thought that was hilarious. You wrote an article recently in Consortium News titled "Russia's Dirty Bomb Scare," and you laid out some history of past dirty bombs used. And from what it seems like, you seem to think that dirty bombs aren't very practical and have never really worked and couldn't really work. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, it's just that, a nuclear weapon works because you achieve fission. It goes fizz out, goes critical. Big explosion. A dirty bomb, there is no fission. there's radioactive material in a certain quantity. Some of that radioactive material can be very dangerous, very deadly. But the really, really, really bad stuff is held by nation states. There's some dangerous stuff that's out there. We know, for instance, the Soviets used to produce these nuclear batteries that would be used for navigation beacons that they'd put up in remote locations that didn't have access to electricity. So they had these nuclear batteries that would keep them going. And hunters would on occasion find one and die because they would sleep next to it to stay warm in the winter and die of radiation poisoning. And this stuff would be bad if it got in the hands of terrorists. If a terrorist found this source and was able to not kill himself in the process, wrap it in sufficient lead and then bring it down and attach it to a nuclear device and try and spread it out. That sounds good, but first of all, no one's ever really done it. There's never been a dirty bomb employed in the wild, so to speak. What I mean by that is a real terrorist event in a real urban area where a real dirty bomb was used. It hasn't happened yet. It's tried. The Moscow in 1995, I talk about that in the article. I talk about in Chechnya in 1998. We talk about the schemes plotted by Al-Qaeda, the arrest of Jose Padilla, but none of this actually reached fruition. We know that the Iraqis actually produced dirty bombs, 1,000-pound aerial bombs, high explosive with a zirconium-95 core, but they tested it, and the conclusion was you had to be within 10 meters of the center of detonation in order to receive enough radiation to be lethal. If you're within 10 meters of a 1,000-pound high explosive device going off, it ain't the radiation that killed you. Yeah. It's the high explosive. So and it didn't spread it. It didn't create this massive thing. It was just a stupid device. And they said, we're done with this. Israel tested 20 radiological weapons, dirty bombs in various configurations between 2010 and 2014 and found the same thing. They tend to blow up and the radiation isn't spread. It's not lethal. It's primarily a psychological weapon. So that's the reality of it. People are scared of it because they hear radiation and they think the worst things. But no, the dirty bombs are not a viable military weapon, and they're not even that good as a terrorist weapon.
Yeah, seems strange to me. Why exactly is that? Is it just very hard to disperse this radioactive material, or is that the issue?
Yeah, I mean that's primarily the issue is that it'll remember it's not about creating radiation poison. It's about creating lethal doses of radiation. So you're going to blow it up. The majority of it goes up, and then gets scattered, and it dissipates, and it ends up instead of having a concentrated amount of cesium, you have one little cesium particle here and one there, and oftentimes it doesn't exceed background radiation. We're getting radiated every time we go outside. The Earth has background radiation. That's just the way the world works. And sometimes when you blow up these dirty bombs, you barely exceed background radiation, let alone come close to what constitutes a lethal dose. It's just difficult to do. Now, if you breathe in the particle and it gets in your lungs, you're screwed. You're going to get lung cancer and die, 5 years, 10 years down the road. But in terms of achieving the objective of having people dropping dead on the spot, that just isn't going to happen.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting that they claimed that they would do it over Chernobyl. Is that what happened?
Well, again, that's that. Why not? I mean, if you're going to go ahead and try and turn a Tochka into an Iskander, why not do it over Chernobyl?
Right.
I mean, it makes nothing about that story makes any sense.
Yeah, it seems very strange. I want to move on now to about a week ago. We saw that video where like the Hollywood special effects people are showing how they make Zelensky look like he's in the streets of Kiev or outside in front of his office. Meanwhile, he's really in front of a green screen. And I thought that was strange because, in American media, Western media, they've been hyping Zelensky up as like a hero and like he's on the streets with his people. And meanwhile, they just admitted to us that, he's hiding in a bunker or something or getting in front of a green screen. And that makes me wonder, are they prepping the American public and the Western public for Zelensky no longer being in power, whether due to an overthrow or a Russian strike? Or do you think that might be what's going on? They're prepping people to be prepared for Zelensky being out of power?
No, I think what was going on is that there were people knew he was talking from a green screen. He wasn't fooling anybody.
Yeah.
They knew it was happening. So why not get ahead of the story? Rather than trying to pretend that it's not happening, why not explain how it's happening and why it's happening? He's a man under siege. He does this to create an impression it's a security thing, you see, because he's not really outside. So if the Russians want to bomb him outside, he'll be in a bunker. I think this was just part of the Frank's piece, what I would have recommended. I would have said, look, they know we're using a green screen. So rather than deny it and look like an idiot, why don't we show them how we do it? Why don't we just confess to doing it? Because it's not a sin. It's so what, we're using a green screen. I'm the president of Ukraine. I'm at war with Russia. They're talking about taking out decision-making targets. I'm the ultimate decision-making target. So why shouldn't it make it more difficult for you to know where I'm at? So this is how we're doing it. I stand in front of the screen. I put on these things and I move around, and isn't that pretty cool? I think this is much ado about nothing. I think people trying to read something into nothing. It's a nothing story.
Yeah. You kind of started to answer my next question. I was going to mention how Russia talks about striking decision-making centers and things like that. And my question is, how much longer do you think that Ukrainian leadership has, Zelensky and military leadership have, before Russia starts to hit them?
Well, again, this is just my assessment. I have no insight into anything in terms of direct information.
Of course.
It makes sense. It would have made sense for Russia to hit decision-making centers day one. It's the first thing you do. In the Gulf War, we went after Saddam day one. And we didn't stop going after Saddam until the war ended. People, that's assassination. No, it's called a leadership target. That's what you do. You take it out. And we continuously looked for leadership targets, and we continually struck things that we thought were leadership targets. So if I were on the Russian general staff planning this conflict, I'd have tried to take Zelensky out day one. But I'm not on the Russian general staff, and they're not fighting this conflict in a mirror image of Desert Storm or any other American conflict. This is a special military operation where the goals and objectives weren't the elimination of Zelensky, but rather, the denazification of the Ukrainian government and the demilitarization of Ukraine. And that didn't mean the total elimination of the Ukrainian military. It meant getting NATO out of Ukraine. That was their objectives. To take out the leadership target, that's what you do when you're at war. And Russia has tried to make the case that they're not at war with Ukraine. I believe that it has been communicated to Russia that while Russia has said that it's a red line for people to strike, for the Ukrainians to strike inside Russia and stuff like that, I think the West has said, look, we'll do our best to hold Ukraine back. We can't guarantee an outcome, and they couldn't. Like Daria Dugina got blown up in Moscow, and the Crimea Bridge got hit by a terrorist bomb. But no attack and missiles have been provided. No long-range strike capabilities have been provided. And NATO doesn't want this thing to escalate into a Russia-NATO conflict.
Yeah. So
NATO has said, look, we'll do our best to hold the Ukrainians back. But if you hit decision-making centers, if you go after their national leadership, there's nothing I can do. All bets are off. The Ukrainians will be given carte blanche to do whatever they want to do in response. So I think there's a little bit of a quid pro quo going on here, an understanding by Russia that if Ukraine crosses a red line, the decision-making centers will be hit. But Russia's winning right now. This is the point I tried to make people say, why doesn't Russia do this, do that, do this? They're winning. It's not a quick victory. It's not, something's going to happen overnight, but momentum is on their side. Anybody who looks at this situation on the ground says all advantages Russia, no advantages Ukraine. So why would Russia disrupt this formula? Why would Russia do something that dramatically changes the framework that they're operating in right now? Their goal isn't to kill Zelensky. Their goal is to get Zelensky out of power. And by winning this conflict the way they do, they weaken Zelensky. They make it unlikely that he'll be able to stay in power, and he'll either be removed domestically or he'll flee to an external location. If you kill Zelensky, there's the danger you're going to turn him into a martyr. And he's going to become a rallying cry, not just for Ukrainians, but for all of Europe. You've escalated this. You've personalized this. You've changed the dynamic. And maybe that changing that dynamic suddenly means that that thing that was a guaranteed victory ain't so guaranteed anymore. So why would Russia do something that lessens the chance of victory rather than increases the chance? And in this case, let Zelensky be Zelensky. Again, my advice as an intelligence guy, now seeing what I see, I would say, hey, look, guys, Zelensky right now is in a little bit of a civil war with his Minister of Defense. Minister of Defense wants to be a little bit more pragmatic in the use of force. He doesn't want to burn out the reserves and futile attacks that are done only for political purpose. He wants to conserve his forces that can be used, militarily. And so there's an internal conflict going on. If you take Zelensky out of the problem, maybe the Ukrainians aren't going to burn out their reserves so quickly. And from the Russian perspective, I'd like to have their reserves burned out rather than be kept as a strategic fire brigade. So, there's that old saying, when the enemy's doing what you want them to do, let them do it. Yeah. And right now, Zelensky and the Minister of Defense or the commander of the Ukrainian military, they're engaged in a little battle. And it's to Russia's advantage. So why take that out? Why eliminate that and have something new come in that you can't predict the outcome? Zelensky and the Minister of Defense are predictable. I can predict tomorrow what each one of them is going to say, and the tensions are growing. So if Zelensky's going to be removed, it's going to be because somebody from the Ministry of Defense has gotten fed up with his interference, no longer views him as being a valuable asset to attract Western investment. The West is starting to back away. And when they back away to a certain number, what value does Zelensky bring to the table anymore? None. So he's going to get the 75-cent solution in the back of his head, and that's it. That's what Russia is letting happen. There's no reason for Russia other than to feel good. And one thing you can say about the Russian military is they've avoided the trap of responding to public pressure. They're not letting the pundits on Russian TV dictate their course of action. They've taken a lot of hits, a lot of criticism. People attacking this, attacking that, attacking this. And the general Surovikin doesn't care. I don't even think he watches TV. He's too busy looking at the big map, moving troops around, doing real stuff. He's not out where, watching Ritter's podcast. I don't think he wakes up and going, I need to know what Scott Ritter thinks. He doesn't give a damn. And he doesn't care what the people on Russian TV think. It's not his job. He's going to do what he needs to do as a military professional to accomplish his mission. So all the talk right now in Russian media and elsewhere about we have to hit decision-making center. Why aren't we doing that? First of all, they don't get to make the call. He does. And he knows why he's not doing it. And there's a reason for that, because it doesn't further the military advantage of Russia in any significant way.
Yeah, you talked about the West starting to back up a bit. And in the last week or so, it does seem like we're starting to see Western officials, both high-ranking, like Emmanuel Macron, the French president, and lower level diplomats and whatnot, like who was it? The Congressional Progressive Caucus signed that letter where they said, Joe Biden should enter into negotiations to end this war. And then, of course, they got shamed so much that they retracted. But my question is, with Macron and with leaders in the West moving towards wanting negotiations, do you think negotiations would even be possible at this point with the Zelensky government?
Why would Russia negotiate?
Well, yeah.
I mean, there's no reason for Russia to negotiate unless it's a surrender. Russia has stated objectives of the special military operation. To negotiate now implies that Russia is not willing to complete the mission. And they've been saying all along, we will Those objectives stay the same. They're unchanged. We're going to do this. Now, a negotiation means they weren't serious about that. Russia didn't invade Ukraine to win a massive military victory in Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine because it was part and parcel of an aggressive posturing by NATO that diminished Russia's legitimate national security. Russia's ultimate objective is a new European security framework. That's why all of this is happening. It's happening because Russia wants a new European security framework. And I can guarantee you that nobody in Russia articulates the new European security framework in a manner which allows for an embittered, embattled Ukrainian state to remain in place in a zone of conflict against Russia in a perpetual war of attrition that will never end. That's sort of what they're trying to avoid by doing this. So there's not going to be a negotiated settlement that has the Zelensky government remaining, that has a NATO, military structure in place in Ukraine, which has all the makings of a forever war, because Russia's going to hold on to territory it says belongs to Russia. Ukraine is denying that. They're backed by the West. It says no, that will never be. Ukraine's not been disarmed, so every once in a while they're going to fire rockets into Russian cities. That's not where Russia started. So why in God's name would they engage in negotiations that especially since, again, Russia's not losing, they're winning. So why would you negotiate? Where's the impetus on this? The West is talking about negotiations because the West is realizing we lost. It's over. We don't have anything left to give them. We gave them everything. We can't afford to continue to underwrite their economy. We have our own problems at home that we have to take a look at. And so they're the ones saying we need a diplomatic off-ramp, but they can't even articulate what that means. I mean, when you say we need a diplomatic off-ramp and your going in position is, that means Russia gives up everything, go back to the February 24th line and give up Crimea. No, in order to get that, guys, you have to beat Russia. You have to defeat Russia. And you're not, you're losing. So you really think Russia's going to give everything up? Ukraine won't accept that. Zelensky had a chance back in April to come up with a negotiated settlement that limited his loss to the Donbass and Crimea. He would have retained Kherson, Zaporizhia. But the West told him, no deal. If you negotiate that way, you get no more support from us. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, remember that the Russians need to denazify Ukraine. That means that they have to get rid of a regime that they the Constitution. They have, but they've even called the Zelensky regime, a Nazi regime, which means you have to get rid of Zelensky. You have to get rid of the parliament. You have to change the Constitution. That's total defeat. You don't get that through negotiation. You get that by defeating Ukraine, collapsing Ukraine, and being able to install a new Ukrainian political reality. You get that by occupying Western Ukraine, occupying Lvov, outlawing the political parties, hunting down the Banderas and bringing them to justice, whatever justice means. That's denazification. That's not going to happen through negotiation. That's going to happen through, force of arms. And demilitarization, the entire Ukrainian military structure is a de facto proxy of NATO. It's a NATO military. So demilitarization means the total elimination of the Ukrainian military. They can either do it through voluntary disarmament. We surrender, just like defeated armies do. They line up, they drop their weapons, they all salute smartly, they're taken into custody, they're processed, and then they're returned home as, demobilized soldiers, no more army. Or they can do it on the field of battle, in which case they die, they're wounded, or they're captured. So that's not something that happens through negotiation either. The only negotiation that's going to take place is going to be that which occurred between the United States and Japan at the end of World War II. Unconditional surrender. Unconditional surrender. Now, there were conditions. We know that. They got to keep the emperor. That's a big deal. But we didn't talk about that. And I'm sure the Russians will come up with something that, appeases Ukrainian national. I don't think we could have brought an end to the conflict had we not allowed the emperor to stay in Japan. I think the Japanese would have fought us to the bitter end. Really? Sure, the emperor was everything. If we said the dissolution of the empire, the Japanese would have fought an ongoing conflict until we killed them all. That's what would have happened. The only reason they surrendered is they listened to the emperor's voice. They never heard it before. He broadcast on a radio, and oh my God, God is speaking to us. Remember, the emperor was God. He's not a man. He's God. So if we came in and said, no, we're going to kill God, they're going to say, no, you're not. We're going to fight you. So we had a compromise. We said unconditional surrender, but we understand the emperor gets to stay. We understand that. And read the history of MacArthur's occupation and what happened there. It's fascinating. And the reason why I bring that up is, when we talk about the unconditional surrender of Ukraine, I think the Russians will be able to have the emperor clause, whatever that ends up being, but something that allows Ukraine to escape this conflict with some national pride, something that isn't total defeat, not like Nazi Germany where we got rid of everything. So who knows what the end's going to look like, but it certainly isn't going to be the Ukrainians achieving on the negotiating table what they can't achieve on the battlefield. Russia's not going to back up, surrender, or stop.
So you seem to think that there will still be some sort of Ukrainian state at the end of this conflict. Is that correct?
Well, there'll be a Ukrainian state. I don't know what it's going to look like. And that's up to Ukraine, literally. I mean, if they continue, what I can tell you is if this war continues on the trajectory it's at, Ukraine will be cut off from all access to the ocean. Russia will take Odessa. And Russia has to be honest. Transnistria has to be connected to the Russians physically, just because Russia can't allow this festering wound to become an abscess that's going to need to be lanced 5 years from now. They need to resolve this problem. They need to link up and make it clear that Moldova will never get Transnistria back, and whether they absorb it through a referendum, that's their business, but they have to do that. And when they do that, Ukraine becomes a landlocked nation. That automatically weakens it as a nation state. What's going to happen to Western Ukraine? I don't think Poland's going to get it, but Belarus may occupy it to prevent Poland from getting it, and then govern it as some sort of not a colony, but a protectorate. Until they denazify, until they cleanse Western Ukraine of all Bandera elements, and then they can return it to the Kievan rump state, which is going to be what remains. Kiev and the immediate surrounding areas. There'll be a new government there. And the bottom line is Ukraine is going to be an extraordinarily physically reduced state with reduced economic potential, primarily agrarian nation. They'll lose much of their industry. And that's it. That's the future of Ukraine. So there'll be a Ukraine, but it's not going to look anything like Ukraine looked like before this conflict started.
Yeah, Ukraine was, of course, already the poorest nation in Europe before this conflict. So to take away more of their economy is just going to destroy them even more. So say Belarus occupies Western Ukraine and they govern it for a short time and they denazify and all that and then return it to whatever remains of Ukraine. What stops Poland at that point from then going and taking it once Belarus withdrawals?
Russia.
Yeah. Do you think Russia would be willing to go to war with Poland over what remains?
100%. They're already at war with Poland. It's done by proxy. Polish army divisions, maybe not divisions, but battalions and higher, are already operating in Ukraine. They just took off the Polish insignia. They put on the Ukrainian insignia. Western Ukraine. Again, Russia's not in the business of allowing NATO to come up to the Russian border. The European security framework is about drawing them apart. So Russia is not going to allow NATO, and Poland is a NATO member, to absorb Western Ukraine. It just isn't going to happen. And Russia will fight anybody that tries to take Western Ukraine. And unless NATO wants to commit suicide, NATO's not going to provide any sort of legitimacy or operational cover for Poland going into Western Ukraine. So if Poland did that, they'd lose their Article 5 protection, and then they would just die. So no, it's a Polish fantasy that they're going to get Western Ukraine. And I think the fact that, first of all, that fantasy, the Poles started believing it because the Russians withdrew, of course, from Kiev, redeployed their troops over to the east. And Poland's looking at the map going, there ain't nobody to stop us from doing this anymore. Maybe we could do it. And that's why the head of the Russian intelligence service said, we have information that Poland's thinking about coming into Western Ukraine, et cetera, creating a fait accompli. Which is why you now have 70 to 80,000 Russian troops up in Belarus, backed up by hundreds of thousands of Belarusian forces, and the president of Belarus has said that any Polish move into Western Ukraine would be an existential threat to Belarus, justifying their engagement. So Russia is prepared now to resolve this question. If eventually this war ends with Russian troops on the Ukrainian NATO border, staring across the border into the hopefully panicked eyes of Polish troops, Romanian troops, Hungarian troops. But it doesn't end with Poland in charge of Western Ukraine.
How is Poland managing to send battalions into Ukraine to fight Russia without essentially declaring war on Russia?
You assemble a battalion in Poland and you say, okay, we need volunteers. You're gonna go over into Ukraine. You're gonna fight the Russians. Everybody volunteer. Volunteer. Okay, take off your Polish flags, put on your Ukrainian flags, and go. That's how they do it. It's that easy.
What I don't understand about that is, it just seems like there has to be some type of the Polish government has to declare war on Russia at that point. You're sending your troops to fight Russia. I mean, it's not, if we're talking about it here, clearly it's not hidden. You know what I mean? So how can they do that?
Oh no, the Russians, no, look, the Russians are killing them. It's not like the Russians are going, oh, are there any Poles out here? The Russians are engaging a unit, hitting it with artillery, moving in and going, these ain't Ukrainians. These are all Poles. And the Russians like, okay, next Polish person who wants to commit suicide, come on up. The Russians are fully aware of this. It's part of the overall, issue of, what do you do with the Brits and the Americans and the Canadians that are over there fighting? You kill them. Mm-hmm. But Russia's not going to alter, again, the algorithm that seems to be working right now by doing something precipitous. They don't want a war with Poland. If Poland wants to send over, tens of thousands of Polish troops, sheep dipped as Ukrainian troops, that's Poland's business. Russia will just kill them.
Yeah, we've also seen reports that fighters from like Islamic terror groups in Syria and throughout the Middle East have been transferred to Ukraine to fight on the side of the Ukrainians, as well as many Western mercenaries that you mentioned. And that makes me wonder how much of the Ukrainian military is really Ukrainian at this point.
The vast majority of it is really Ukrainian. Yeah, I mean the mercenaries. I don't know which numbers to believe, but they're 10,000, 20,000 in a military structure that today probably numbers around 800,000. Wow. So while they play an oversized role on the front because these new mercenary forces they have recruited a better quality of troop than originally. These guys are organized properly. They have proper tactics, and we saw in the Kharkov offensive, especially, they were effective in breaking through the Russian defenses and exploiting the undefeated rear areas of Russia. So they're high quality troops. But we also see what happens when they get employed down in Kherson. Now that the Russian defenses have solidified, they're dying. Mm-hmm. But there's not enough of them. I mean, the bottom line is the majority of the people fighting on the front lines are Ukrainians. Some of them are regular army. Most of them are conscripts. Many of them have been forcefully mobilized. But they're Ukrainians.
You brought up the new offensive, I guess you can call it, in Kherson by the Ukrainians, or Kherson. And, I know that at first people were concerned that Russia would retreat from the area like they did in Kharkov a month ago or so. But what I don't think people understand is that this is now Russia, right? Kherson is now a part of sovereign Russia. They're going to fight and die to defend it. Would you agree with that?
Well, I agree they're going to fight. One of the Russian objectives is to minimize personal casualties. So I don't think Russia's in the business of winning a Pyrrhic victory. They let the Ukrainians do that. I'm not saying they're going to give up Kherson. The fact is, I don't think they will. I think they're fortifying it, and they have every intention to defend it because it's a city. But I believe, like any wise military leader, if I'm looking at my map and I'm looking at the forces and I say, I have a bulge in my defensive line here that's very difficult to defend. The terrain's not in my advantage. It requires a lot of troops. But if I just collapse the bulge and straighten the line down along this river line with these trees here and the elevation here, that's a stronger defensive line for the moment. So you collapse, you give up the territory to strengthen your defensive line. And Russia's done that. The defensive positions that they hold in Kherson today are extraordinarily powerful. Everybody's expecting the Ukrainians to break through and capture villages and everything. And in the last couple of weeks, every attack has been repulsed. The Russians haven't lost any territory. They've destroyed tens of thousands of Ukrainian lives, hundreds of pieces of equipment, because now they have enough manpower to carry out a doctrinal defense. They're actually defending the way they were trained to defend. This isn't the special military operation where you just sort of do whatever the hell you want to do. This is, we're defending this territory. What does our doctrine tell us to do? Strong points, channeling them into, fire kettles, areas identified where we're going to break up the assault with artillery fire. We have plenty of artillery on hand. We have air on hand. We have everything on hand. We're ready to do this, and they're winning. Just in case the Ukrainians did break through, then they have a fully manned secondary line. They can fall back on that. And if that gets broken, they have a third line. Then they have reserves that can be brought in and crush the Ukrainians as they penetrate into a channel pre-designed by Russia for that purpose, to channel them in. And the Ukrainians haven't shown the ability to overcome this. So, Russia is defending doctrinally. They're going to hold on to Kherson, and then eventually they're going to counterattack. That's one of the great strengths of Russia, is the ability to receive an attack and then counterattack. That's the old Soviet way too. The Soviets, not until the very end, the Soviets never started their wars by attacking. They always started their military exercises by receiving a NATO attack and then counterattack. And I think Russian military doctrine today is built that way as well, to receive the attack and counterattack. And pretty soon they're going to counterattack. And when they do, I don't think Ukraine has sufficient military force to resist it.
We saw in the other areas that Russia retreated from in the Kharkov direction about a month ago in the Kharkov offensive. We saw reports and some videos of Ukrainian troops. The claim is that they were killing civilians, that they classified as
collaborators.
Collaborators, thank you. Yeah, collaborators with Russia. And that seems to be what would be the biggest threat of losing Kherson, would be something like that happening again. Would you agree with that? And do you believe that the Ukrainians were indeed killing people that they thought were collaborators?
Well, we know they do. They admit it. They admit it. They just say straight up. They admitted it in Bucha. That's why I don't understand why everybody comes up with this narrative of Russia did it in Bucha. Only the Ukrainians are on record confessing to carrying out cleansing operations designed to eliminate collaborators. I mean, there it is. And they're doing the same thing in Kharkov, and they would do the same thing anywhere where they take a village and there's a civilian population there. We know that they're punishing, there were school teachers in the occupied zones who only care about their students. And they were looking at a reality that said, we got to teach a school here. But in order to do that, now that Russia's taken over, Russia won't allow this school to function unless it functions in accordance with Russian standards. So many of these teachers went to Russia to get trained. They could come back and teach the kids. And now the Ukrainians have recaptured this territory, and those teachers are being treated as traitors. You betrayed the Ukrainian motherland by going to Russia and receiving specific training on how to apply the Russian teaching techniques to these Ukrainian students. All these teachers were trying to do is live and do the right thing and help the Ukrainian children, but they're being arrested, they're being murdered. We know that that's happening. The Russians have evacuated tens of thousands of people from Kherson. And a lot of people said, well, that's intent. We believe that's happening because they plan on surrendering Kherson. They ain't surrendering anything. They evacuated because Kherson is about to become a frontline battlefield. And Russia is one of the, is a responsible nation when it comes to the laws of war. You're not allowed to use civilians as a human shield. So if Russia's making a decision that they're going to defend in an urban built-up area, heavily populated, they remove the civilians. Unlike the Ukrainians, who kept all the civilians there and used them as a human shield. It's not me just saying this. The Washington Post, the Human Rights Watch have published reports that say this. That's how the Ukrainians operate. That's not how the Russians operate. But again, the media, looking for any spin they can put on the story that makes the Russians look weak, said, oh, the Russians are pulling out the civilians, so they're getting ready to abandon Kherson. They ain't abandoning Kherson. They're fighting for Kherson, but they're obeying international law by getting the civilians out of the way.
Mm-hmm. We saw that video. I'm sure you saw it, where it appears that they're rolling dead bodies onto mass graves, and it appears it's the Ukrainians doing it. But I heard in Western media they said that, well, no, it's not the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians recovered that video from a dead Russian soldier's phone. What do you think about that claim?
No.
Yeah,
the Ukrainians killed them. They got caught. I mean, one of the things about these criminal mass murders of this kind is, for whatever reason, they like to document their crimes. If there's ever a trial of Azov people about what happened in Mariupol, they'll be convicted on the evidence that was contained in their cell phones. They filmed the rapes, they filmed the murder, they filmed the abuse. And, we know that that's what they're doing right now in Kharkov. They're filming it. They filmed it. We know who did this. We know the people involved. The Russians know. But the thing is, the Ukrainian government wanted to have a Bucha 2.0 coming out of Kharkov to get that same sort of propaganda boost from the fabrication of the Bucha massacre. And when I say fabrication, I don't mean people didn't die. The fabrication is to say that Russia did it. It wasn't Russia, it was the Ukrainians. But they used Bucha to generate the kind of anger amongst the Western civilian population so they would continue to support, the provision of tens of billions of dollars of military equipment and financial aid. They tried to do it in Kharkov and nobody was biting. It became apparent that everything was a fabrication, was fraud. So they stopped. But one of the reasons why it was so apparent is idiots like to film the crimes they committed. There was no reason for them to film them taking the guy up there, shooting him, having his body rolled down into a ditch. No reason other than the perverse fantasy of these sick neo-Nazi thugs.
Yeah. I remember it with the Bucha massacre. That was very early on in the conflict. And from what I remember, all the dead bodies in the streets that they showed had white flags or white cloth wrapped around their arm, which shows that they were, working with the Russians. Not necessarily working with the Russians, but, being peaceful with the Russian, occupiers, so to speak. And, that should be a sign to anybody that it wasn't the Russians killing people that, considered to be on the side of Russia. But I wanted to move. Russia recently carried out or has started their nuclear exercises where they're testing some ballistic missiles and whatnot. And this, of course, comes right after NATO carried out their nuclear exercises in Europe. Do you think that Russia's exercises will be used further for the West to further escalate, or do you think it's a sign to the West that they need to calm down and de-escalate? Or
these were annual exercises. I mean, they happened every year on time. So there was no hidden meaning here. This isn't as though Russia said, okay, let's do an exercise of our strategic nuclear forces to send a signal to the West. This was an annual exercise. The same thing with the NATO exercise. Now, NATO, I believe, had a moral responsibility to postpone these exercises after Zelensky called for a preemptive nuclear strike. Even though NATO wasn't going to carry out a preemptive nuclear strike, the mere fact that it had been placed on the table by an ally of the West should have been enough for Jens Stoltenberg to say, we're postponing this exercise for the time being because we don't want to create an environment of potentially dangerous escalation. I believe had they done that, I personally believe the Russians would have postponed their nuclear exercises for the same reason. But they didn't, so they went on. But these exercises weren't about proving a political point. They were simply the kind of annual exercises every military undertakes to make sure that the forces work as designed. And that's what the Russians are doing right. They're testing a submarine ballistic launch. They're testing the road mobile missile. They're testing the silo-based missiles. They're making sure that the everything works the way it's designed to work, communications techniques, etc. And that's how you maintain a viable deterrent force, by exercising it. And you do it in a transparent way so the world can see, aha, Russia's capable of doing all this stuff. We believe in the value and the strength of the Russian nuclear deterrence. So that's what I think is going on. I don't think any of this was designed to be deliberately provocative.
Yeah. Russia says time and time again that they would never carry out a first strike. They never carry out a first strike. I believe them. I think you do as well. But do you agree that Russia would never carry out a first strike unless their very existence was threatened? Because that's what they say they would do.
I 100% believe it.
Yeah.
Russia's not going to carry out a preemptive nuclear strike. Russia's not going to engage in limited nuclear war. Russia has a nuclear deterrence that will be used to respond in kind to any nuclear attack against it. It also has a nuclear deterrence that will respond if the very existence of the Russian state is ever brought into question by outside powers. And that's it. I take the Russians at their word. There's no reason to doubt them.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And, people criticize Russia for saying that they would protect their nation, with any means necessary if they came under threat to their very existence. And to me, that just sounds like something that any, respectable nation would do. Would you not agree?
Yeah, I mean, a nuclear deterrence is of no value unless people believe that there's the potential for it to be used. Yeah. So Russia has a duty and responsibility to exercise it and to make people aware of what their doctrine is. But that doesn't mean that Russia's blackmailing people or threatening people.
Yeah. I wanted to move to the Iranian drones we've been seeing the Russians use, and to great effect, really. And it seems like they use those to overwhelm whatever remains of Ukrainian air defenses. And then they send in cruise missiles. Am I correct that that's sort of the strategy, is to overwhelm the air defenses with these kamikaze drones to then send in cruise missiles?
I think that's an evolving strategy. I think, the Russians brought this in as a supplement to strike targets that didn't need to be struck with expensive Russian cruise missiles, to instead use these relatively cheap kamikaze drones. And in the process, the Russians, like any professional military, observes and then adapts based upon what they observe. And they observed that if they flooded the zone with threats, that the Ukrainian air defenses were unable to respond, and therefore were ultimately ineffective.
Why is it that air defenses struggle so much against these drones? The Shahed 136.
Why is it what?
Why is it that the air defenses seem to struggle so much against these drones? Even American air defenses in Saudi Arabia struggled against them. Why is that?
Well, I think they're slower. They have a lower radar cross section. They have materials that don't reflect radar activity well. most air defenses are designed to take on a modern threat. So you're looking at high-speed aircraft, you're looking at missiles, et cetera. You come in something that comes in with a different approach, different speed, different material, and the system's not programmed. Then the other thing is you flood it. Let's say they finally get the solution how to shoot down the Shahed 136 drone, but you flood it. You flood the zone, and they can't handle that many targets. And remember, the S-300 system might, under ideal circumstances, be able to engage multiple targets, but that's with their radar functioning nonstop. But here we have a situation, if the radar functions nonstop, the Russians have anti-radiation missiles that will be fired against the radar and take it down. So the radars are being cued in a limited fashion, and they get triggered by, the first wave they cue, but then they have to shut down, and then the next wave comes in and they slip through the radar coverage. Basically, I think the Russians have found a way to overwhelm Ukrainian air defense, and I believe they're going to overwhelm it, even if they incorporate newer U.S. systems like the NASAMS or the German Iris-T. I think the other thing you have to remember is the current Ukrainian air defense is all Soviet manufactured. Mm-hmm. It's not interoperable with any of these other systems. So you're going to bring in these other systems, and they're not going to be able to talk to the Russian air defense. The Ukrainians are now happy. Somebody just sold them the Hawk, the Hawk anti-air missile. It's not going to be integrated. It doesn't, So there is no integrated air defense in Ukraine anymore. It's just a bunch of haphazard systems thrown together that the Russians will just overwhelm.
Didn't the U.S. just transfer to NASAMS to Ukraine?
Say again?
Didn't the U.S. just transfer to NASAMS to Ukraine?
That's what they say. Yeah.
Yeah. You don't think those could really be effective or integrated into the Ukrainian air defense system?
Well, I know they can't be integrated in the Ukrainian air defense system. They're not designed to be integrated into a Soviet era air defense system. They will cover what they do. But the NASAMS, my understanding of it is it's simply repurposed air-to-air missiles. So they're the kind of missiles that you'd have on an F-15 or an F-16, but they've been repurposed to a ground launch mode. And they don't have the kind of maneuverability that allows them to shoot down advanced, Russian cruise missiles. And they may be too. They're too expensive. The Russians are spending $30,000 on one of these Shahed 136s, and you're going to fire it out there and fire a missile that costs several $100,000 or $1 million to shoot it down. I'll play that game all day long. Shahed. I'll overwhelm. You'll fire the missiles, and sooner or later you're going to run out of missiles. And when you do run out of missiles, there's no more missiles to come in to supply you. The NASAMS was not designed to operate in time of war. It was designed to provide point protection of a national command center from a terrorist attack or a limited attack. It wasn't designed to survive a lengthy strategic air campaign. That the other air defense systems do that. This was point defense designed to protect the United States Capitol District from a terrorist attack, from a 9/11 type hijacked aircraft or something of that nature. It's not intended to do what it's being asked to do right now. So it's not going to work. And the Iris-T is just too expensive. The other thing is, in order for these things to work, their radars have to be functioning. And the Russians aren't stupid. As the radars function, the radars will be targeted and these radars will be eliminated, and then you don't have an air defense system anymore. So this is just the kind of stupidity and wishful thinking that takes place in the West, where they think they can, I don't know what they think, what they're going to intimidate Russia by supplying the newest air defense. I'm pretty sure the Russian intelligence services have been collecting on these air defense systems as we collect against theirs, and have been coming up with, ways to defeat them. So the West isn't hitting Russia with anything they're not already aware of. And Russia will deal with it the way it always deals with identified military threats. Take it out.
Yeah. So U.S. Air defense systems have struggled against Shaheeds in the past. When Iran attacked the oil fields in Saudi Arabia a couple of years ago, I believe those oil fields had a Patriot defense system stationed at them, and the Patriots were ineffective against the Shaheeds. I don't even think they shot down one. And the Iranians claim that the Shaheeds have flown over U.S. ships and the Persian Gulf naval ships. And I've been thinking that as Russia uses more and more of them in Ukraine, that the United States might be able to figure out how to defend against them. Do you think that's possible?
Well, that's always the case. I mean, that's always the case. Any intelligence service worth its salt is going to be monitoring what's going on and writing lesson learned paper. I can guarantee you, somewhere in the United States, there's a bunch of guys that that's their job, and they're writing papers on the identified strengths of the Shahed 136. How do we how can we overcome them? These are things we can do. But what the Russians are doing? They're looking at the Shahed 136 too, and they're going, it's a pretty cool system, but we could do this to it. We could modify it this way. They already have new generations coming out. So as we say, oh, we're responding to version 1, the Russians come out with version 2. We're responding to version 2, they come out with version 3. It's that decision-making loop, OODA loop. And Russia's inside NATO's OODA loop. NATO's reacting to Russia. Russia's not reacting to NATO. So Russia's going to win this kind of intelligence-driven competition.
Yeah, I wanted to move. It's old news at this point, but it's happened since the last time you were on here, and so I wanted to address it. Obviously, Nord Stream was blown up, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, and the Russians say that it was done with a Seafox drone. And I read one of your articles. I forget where it was published. I'm sorry. But you talk about how in 2015, a Seafox drone with explosive ordnance was found directly underneath, essentially, Nord Stream 1. And the U.S. claimed that they had lost control of it, and it just happened to land right there by the pipeline. And I just thought that's one of the most absurd things I've ever heard. I just wanted to, hear your opinion on the Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2 sabotage.
Well, I mean, let's pull back from the technicalities for a second. This is it's a terrorist act. There's no other way to describe it. So let's say I'm a prosecutor and I'm investigating a terrorist act. I'm trying to build a case. Do I have a confession? Sort of do. Joe Biden on February 7th. If Russian tanks cross into NATO, Nord Stream 2 will cease to function.
Yes.
What do you mean? That's a piece of German infrastructure. I guarantee it'll stop. That's a confession. Straight up confession. It gives you intent. Now, another question that's always asked is, cui bono? Who benefits? What's the motive? Anthony Blinken shows up. And instead of telling the Germans, hey, we're really sorry this happened. This is terrible. We're going to investigate with you, find out who did this. Shame on you, Russia. He said, this is a great opportunity to do. Who says it's a great opportunity after a terrorist attack? How would we have responded if Germany come to us after 9/11 saying this is a great opportunity? It ain't opportune. It's an attack. But now we've identified motive. Then we need means, and we know that the United States Navy has carried out exercises in the exact same area that these explosions took place. The exercises were heavily involved what they call unmanned underwater vehicles, UUVs, the Seafox, which is an anti-mine drone that's guided into moored mines or underwater mines, and you come in, you put it next to it, and then you blow it up. We use it extensively in the Persian Gulf to blow up Iranian mines, and we've used them in this area. We know why a Seafox was found, as you said, in 2015 under a Nord Stream 1 pipeline. And according to some reports, the Swedes found one under the one Nord Stream 2 pipeline that wasn't blown up. They collected debris from the other ones, so they know who did this. But even if we can't get the murder weapon, because sometimes you have to prosecute a case where you don't actually have the murder weapon. You go with circumstantial evidence, and the circumstantial evidence is that the U.S. Navy was training with it's the same thing. If I bought a gun and I'm out in my backyard firing the gun into a stump over and over and over again, I'm creating circumstantial evidence that this weapon was in my hands and I trained to fire it. And now we have a murder where we know the kind of weapon, but we don't have the weapon, but we have a bullet and it matches the bullet in the stump. That's circumstantial evidence. We have strong circumstantial evidence that places the United States at the scene of the crime using the very weapons that would be necessary to blow up the pipelines. So we have intent, we have motive, we have means. I could take this to court and convict the United States of a crime that easy.
Yeah,
purely circumstantial case.
Yeah, the evidence is overwhelming, but at the same time, you have Western media and even government saying that, it was Russia. Russia blew up their own pipeline. And this is after they've said for years that, Russia uses energy as a weapon on Europe, right? So they agree that Russia's biggest piece of influence over Europe is energy. So why would Russia blow up their pipeline? It makes no sense.
It makes no sense.
Yeah. And should be taken serious. I wanted to move. I've heard this talking point now for months about obviously in the 90s, NATO made the agreement with Russia that they wouldn't expand further east. And of course, they lied and have done it like 11 times. And people always say that, well, those countries in Eastern Europe that want to join with NATO want to join with NATO because Russia's such a threat to them. Russia might invade. Russia's very hostile. What do you say to people that bring up that talking point?
Well, I mean, there are some nations that you can make that case for. Poland, the Baltic states, they are all paranoid about Russia. They hate Russia. So that's their argument. But the reality is, remember, there is no open door policy for NATO. What I mean by that is, just because you want to join NATO doesn't mean NATO has to take you in. I think it's Article 10, I could be wrong on this, which talks about expanding NATO membership. Every application has to be evaluated in the manner in which it enhances the security of the alliance. There's not a single person out there rationally can say that bringing Poland and the Baltic states and enhance the security of the alliance. All it did is aggravate Russia, increase the potential of conflict with Russia. NATO didn't have to do this. So this isn't, this was a decision made by NATO a long time ago to expand. And so NATO creates this narrative of a Russian threat. And nations like Poland and the Baltic states are only too willing to parrot this threat. But there was no threat from Russia to NATO, never has been a threat from Russia to NATO. So it's incorrect to say that NATO was justified in expanding because these nations felt a threat and needed to join this alliance. This alliance was expanded to threaten Russia, to undermine Russia, to contain Russia, to weaken Russia. That's the purpose of the expansion.
Yeah. Are you familiar with NAFO?
I've heard about it, yeah.
It's so stupid. I want to know if you had any thoughts on it.
Adults using fuzzy toys as their, whatever it's called, their profile picture, and it just shows you the. Never mind. I just think it's foolish, it's stupid.
The Polish Senate recently adopted a resolution to recognize Russia as a terrorist regime. What do you think about that?
I mean, the Poles do a lot of stupid things. The Poland's a nation that's taken a look at the reality of the situation they're in, and they understand that the defeat of Ukraine is a big problem for Poland. People tend to forget that prior to this Ukraine conflict, the EU was talking about kicking Poland out. They don't like Poland. They don't view Poland as a viable democracy. So Poland's going to have to do things that make itself relevant. And the best way to make itself relevant to NATO is to continue to articulate Russia as a threat worthy of NATO's continued support of Poland. Because if NATO supports Poland, and the EU isn't going to be kicking Poland out anytime soon. All is forgiven if you're deemed to be relevant to NATO. So right now, Poland's trying to shape the narrative of Russia is bad, Russia is evil, Russia is the threat. So why not go ahead and call them a terrorist state? They did. Mm-hmm. It has no impact on anything. The United States isn't calling Russia a terrorist state, and frankly speaking, the United States vote's the only one that counts in this, in this manner. It's too bad for Poland because they're undermining, the possibility of a diplomatic off ramp. How can you don't negotiate with terrorists? So by labeling Russia as state-sponsored terrorists, Poland's saying there are no negotiations. This is a struggle to the death because that's what a struggle against terrorism is. That's the absurdity of it. At a time when NATO should be looking for every possible venue to negotiate with Russia, Poland is creating a framework that eliminates negotiation as a possibility by labeling Russia a terrorist state.
It seems like Poland is doing everything in their power to ensure that they go to war with Russia in the coming year or 2 years. Would you agree with that?
Well, not that they go to war against Russia, that NATO goes to war against Russia. Poland can't beat Russia. Poland doesn't want to go to war with Russia by itself. Poland's they're the 8-year-old, cousin who goes out and throws rocks at the local street gang and then comes back and grabs you and say, hey, back me up. Poland can't fight this by itself. It doesn't have a viable military. It doesn't have a viable economy. It doesn't have viable anything. It's Poland. Mm-hmm. They can't do this without NATO. So that's what they're trying to do is create an environment where NATO will be compelled to support Poland in a conflict with Russia.
It seems like NATO, obviously when we say NATO, it's several countries, but really it's the United States and then everyone that has to listen to the United States. The U.S. doesn't seem to want to actually enter into direct conflict with Russia. And which article of NATO requires all countries to come to the defensive one?
Well, first of all, it doesn't require any.
Well, yeah, that's what
it's Article 5.
Yeah.
It's an attack against one is an attack against all. Okay, but then read the article. It says that the members will consider what they're going to do in response. There's no automatic line everybody up and charge into the fray. We will consider whether or not we want to get involved. And that involvement may or may not include a military aspect. So Article 5 isn't as clad in concrete as everybody makes it out to be.
Yeah, Putin is actually giving a speech right now. I didn't know that was planned. He just said the most dangerous and unpredictable decade is ahead of us. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, it's a decade where the rules-based international order is going to be eliminated. Mm-hmm. It's the end of American hegemony. It's the end of American global empire. And it's very unpredictable what happens as the American empire collapses. What's going to fill it? What's going to replace it? Can it be a controlled collapse where we avoid global conflict, or will it be an uncontrolled collapse that brings chaos and anarchy and creates the potential for conflict? Putin's 100% correct.
It seems like BRICS would be what would fill that void. Would you agree with that?
Something like that. I mean, BRICS is economic. You need to have a certain political element. Just like the G7 is linked to the EU, which is linked to NATO, which is linked to the United States. BRICS is increasingly going to be linked to the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and be linked to whatever this Trans-Eurasian Economic Union ends up looking like. I don't think there is no security component of BRICS, so that's why I don't think BRICS is going to fill the gap, because whatever fills the gap has to have a security component to it, which is the SCO. But BRICS is going to play a very important role in supplanting the G7, and the American Department of Treasury as vehicles of global economic control.
Yeah. The last time you were on, you made a statement where you said that there's really no such thing as stealth in terms of stealth technology with planes and things, and you also made it seem like submarines are fairly easily tracked. I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate on that.
I don't want to get in trouble. Let's put it this way. If we have satellite technology that can track a blue whale based on water displacement,
yeah,
that's all I'm going to say.
Yeah. So submarines are not stealth, is what you're saying.
Submarines displace water.
Yeah.
Physical thing that can't be altered.
Mm-hmm.
If you can track a blue whale displacing water, you can track anything of that size that displaces water.
Very interesting. What about aircraft, stealth aircraft?
Stealth aircraft were designed to counter a certain generation of radar.
Mm-hmm.
People have developed technologies that bring different principles to bear.
You're being very careful about what you say. I find that interesting.
Because we're getting into extraordinarily sensitive issues.
Mm-hmm.
The national security of the United States in many ways depends upon the viability of stealth aircraft. So, I'm not going to sit here and tell everybody how to defeat stealth aircraft.
Right.
I'm not going to tell you how to defeat, a submarine. Our strategic deterrent depends on the survivability of submarine launched ballistic missile capabilities. But I'm just here to tell you that anybody who believes that stealth exists doesn't know what they're talking about. Anybody who believes that submarines can't be tracked doesn't know what they're talking about. Yes, I can take a submarine deep enough so that the displacement maybe won't be as relatively discernible, but I can't launch my missiles from that level. I got to bring myself up at some point. And if you have a monitoring system in place that has the appropriate algorithms programmed in to detect the displacement of water, you now say, oh, an Ohio class submarine is now here, and whatever you need to do to respond to that is what you need to do. It doesn't mean that they can't operate, that it's impossible for them to do things. I'm just saying that anybody who says just a blanket statement that our submarines can't be touched, you're wrong. It doesn't mean all of our submarines can be touched, but I'm here to tell you that submarines aren't as invulnerable as people think they are. Anybody who says that we have stealth aircraft that can penetrate any air defense, you're wrong. They're not invisible. They literally aren't invisible. I can see them. Okay? They have physical properties. And there are things that can be done that detect this. And we know it. We know what our weaknesses are. We just assume that many nations can't do this kind of stuff, and they're wrong. A lot of nations can do it.
Yeah. I live in Missouri, and Whiteman Air Force Base, I believe, is the base that the B-2 is stationed at. And I go hunting quite often, and when I'm in the more rural environments, I've seen the B-2s flying above at times, and you can hear them. And I mean, they're very, very high up, and you can hear them. So like you're saying, not only can you see them, you can hear them, and obviously by the time you hear it, it's probably too late. But, if a B-2 is flying across Poland and somebody hears it in Poland, they can alert, people in Russia that, hey, I just heard a B-2 fly over. It's probably a couple minutes away from you.
We, during the Gulf War, just on that, Task Force 160 or the 160th Special Operations Airborne Regiment, finest pilots in the world, and they fly helicopters that, some of them, have quieting technology, et cetera. But they're very good at picking a seam in radar, and I think they called it spider webbing. But they basically navigate their way through radar to get to where they need to go. And the Air Force did it too with their special operations helicopters. And yet the Iraqis were plotting them in near real time. How? Because they had a dude sitting in a tent and helicopter come over. And got a helicopter coming over, azimuth heading, X estimated, speed, boom. And so somebody in the big map room went, plot, here we go. Then they call up this guy. Yep. Yeah, you have a helicopter coming to you. Let us know when you have it. Oh yeah, the helicopter came, but then it pivoted. It took a new heading. Plot it there. The Iraqis plotted every helicopter insertion into Iraq. We like to believe that they didn't, but they did. They did it using simple, basic guy on the ground listening with a compass and a old landline telephone reporting in.
What about those helicopters that they used on the SEAL Team 6 raid on Bin Laden's compound? Do you believe those were tracked coming in?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know, but I know that they entered with CH-47s that aren't stealth. Think about that for a second. Okay, why in God's name would you employ this heavy, overladen, supposedly stealth helicopter, and then throw it all away by bringing in a giant, clunky MH-47, which isn't stealth, in the same flight parameters? You ain't fooling anybody. It's not stealth that's getting you in. It's flying low, nap of the earth. And then they brought this helicopter in to an environment where, because of its weight, it suffered a lift failure on descent and crashed. Wouldn't have happened if they used a regular, MH-60, but they didn't use it because somebody made the decision that they want to be sexy and bring in the sexy stuff and use the sexy stuff. Sometimes you got to wonder about the logic that goes through people's minds.
Yeah, and one of those helicopters crashed in the compound.
That's what I'm saying. It came in, and they trained on they trained on a parameter that had that used, I believe, chain link fences. So as the helicopter came in, the downwash was dissipated.
Yeah.
But as this one came in, because of the walls, it came in and it suffered a lift failure and hit there. And the interesting thing is, the really experienced pilots predicted this and said, be careful about that. Did the plan anyways. Mm-hmm. That's another story. But.
Yeah. I'm going to pin this comment here. Putin, in the speech he just gave, said the West cannot sit out the crisis it caused. What do you think he means by that exactly?
There are consequences for your actions. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the bottom line. The West caused the Ukraine crisis, literally caused it, made it happen. And Putin's putting them on notice that you're going to be held accountable.
Yeah. How do you think they'll hold the United States accountable ultimately?
Well, not militarily.
Well, of course, yeah.
They're doing it right now. One of the consequences is the collapse of the potential collapse of the European economy because of this energy crisis brought on by the sanctioning of Russian energy. Another consequence is the lack of credibility that's attached to the dollar as a reserve currency. The lack of viability of the petrodollar because the world is stopping using the dollar as the primary mechanism of trade. They're switching to this currency basket that's being created by BRICS. There's talk in the BRICS community about converting this currency basket, which is simply a mechanism which allows trade to be done using the national currencies, not a single dollar. No dollar involved. They're talking about creating a single currency, which isn't the dollar, that will be used as this mechanism so that you don't get into the whole exchange rate stuff. This is a direct consequence of what the United States has done, what the West has done. The West has used this rules-based international order as a mechanism of global control. And the consequence now is that the world is turning its back on the rules-based international order. And I think that's what Putin's saying. He's not saying that Russia is going to go to war against the West. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of people that say, oh, Putin's threatening. No, he's just saying there's consequences. It's Newton's third law. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. In the United States and the West has been out there pushing. Well, they're getting the pushback now. And so be it.
Yeah. Every time the Western media, Western governments fearmonger about Russia coming to war with the U.S., obviously they're lying. Russia seems to understand very well what war between the U.S. and Russia would mean. It pretty much means the end of the world. I'm sure there's people in the deep state or whatever that recognize that, but people in the media don't seem to recognize that. The lower levels of people in government don't seem to recognize that. And it's so dangerous for them to spread this idea that Russia is weak and Russia. It's funny. I saw a tweet the other day. Somebody said they were making fun of mainstream media. They said Russia is so weak that it's losing in Ukraine, but at the same time, Russia's so powerful that it might take over all of Europe. I mean, their narratives conflict with each other on everything.
One of the big problems here is, first of all, we have adults in the room too, who know what the consequences of any conflict between Russia and
it doesn't really seem like it.
Well, say what you want about Joe Biden. He doesn't want this war. He knows what the war is. Say what you want about Lloyd Austin, Mark Milley. They all know what the reality is. That's why they all say there won't be any boots on the ground in Ukraine. Isn't going to happen. But their problem is that we live in an environment where the defense industry plays a overwhelming role in not only our economy, but in shaping our policies. And so keep the defense industry viable, you have to have threats that justify the expense being put in. If we start off as a start, let's just say right off the bat, nuclear wars cannot be won, therefore they should never be fought. That's what we say. Well, then why doesn't our doctrine reference this? Why don't we have a sole purpose doctrine that says the only purpose and the only use that the nuclear weapons will ever be is deterrence? That means if you attack us, we attack you. That's the only way these would ever be used. Sole purpose. We can't do that, because if we did that, suddenly arms control becomes much easier, because now we just start bringing things down as close to zero as possible, because there's no other reason to have nuclear weapons. And if everybody agrees on that model, then we can start reducing it. But if we find nuclear weapons to be of potential value in conflicts where we might have to use them preemptively, or we might use them in a non-nuclear environment, we might do this, we might do that, we might do this, we might do that. Suddenly, we've breathed life into the notion of continued funding of nuclear weapons research, which means we have to modernize the ground-based ballistic missile. We have to modernize the sea-launched ballistic missile. We have to modernize cruise missiles. We have to modernize the bombers. And that goes, and we do that with everything. Our conventional forces. If we said straight up, we ain't never going to fight Russia in Europe because that's just suicide, then why do we need to build a military capable of fighting a ground war in Europe? And if you didn't want to build a military capable of fighting a ground war in Europe, then we don't need all this other garbage that we end up buying. We can downsize. We can make the military, more reflective of what the legitimate national security problems are. But we manufacture a crisis in Europe. We manufacture a threat so we can justify, the continuation of, building these, heavy armored brigades that are the centerpiece of the Army's, strike potential. It's the same thing in Asia. Why do we have to turn Taiwan into a point of conflict? Well, we need a threat worthy of the justification of the money we spend on building a navy, the big navy we have. If we said, no, we're never going to go to war in Taiwan, we're going to work with the Chinese to have a peaceful a result of this, then what do we need this navy for? What do we need as the expeditionary air forces? So we manufacture threats to justify what we build, to justify the expenditures on defense. It makes no sense.
So you say that the U.S. has adults in the room, and you say that Biden and Lloyd Austin they don't want a war, but at the same time they've done everything to ensure that they provoked Russia and Ukraine, and now they're doing everything to ensure that China carries out a military operation in Taiwan. So to me, it doesn't seem like they're trying to avoid war at all.
Well, they yeah, I left out this part of the analysis. They're the adults in the room on the ultimate ramifications of direct conflict, but underneath them is an entire establishment. I don't want to call it the deep state, whatever you want. I just call it the establishment that's premised not on behaving as adults, but premised on sustaining the cycle of threat, procurement, threat, procurement, threat, procurement, threat, procurement. And they all got their power. They all got to where they are not because they've rejected that model, but because they are the living proponents of that model. And they're the ones who shape policy, make policy. Again, ask yourself why Joe Biden would campaign on single purpose nuclear doctrine. When I get president, single purpose, I'm going to do that. Dude, you just published your nuclear posture review, your national defense strategy. There's no single purpose. Why? Because the establishment sat down with them and said, can't do single purpose. If you do single purpose, then we can't build the new ground-based missile. We can't modernize the Ohio class and bring in the Columbia class. We can't build the B-21 because all these things are designed to give us greater flexibility. And if you go single purpose, you take away the argument for these new weapons. And the defense industry can't function, and Congress will never go with it because Congress has allowed the Department of Defense, instead of building a B-21 bomber in a single location, to break it up so it's done in as many of the 50 states as possible. So every congressman and senator has a vested interest in keeping this funding going because it's jobs, and that's how they get reelected, That's the system. And that system is populated by people that have to continue to articulate the world is a dangerous place. And if the world isn't a dangerous place, then we have to make it a dangerous place. And that's what we're doing with Taiwan. That's what we're doing with Russia. Russia is not danger to us. We're making them a danger to us. China is not a danger to us. We're making them a danger to us. We're the ones making war in Taiwan all but inevitable. We're the ones that made the Ukrainian conflict inevitable. When William Burns wrote his Niet means Niet memorandum back in February of 2009, he warned about this. If you continue to try to expand NATO up to Ukraine, Russia will eventually respond militarily, and Ukraine will lose the Crimea and lose the Donbass. Well, Burns, you were wrong, because they lost Kherson and Zaporizhia as well, and they may lose Odessa, they may lose Kharkov, but you had the right idea that this will be a conflict of an existential nature that will cause Ukraine to be dramatically reduced. We knew that in 2009. We knew it. But what did we do? We didn't do the smart thing, which is say, well, then we need to avoid this conflict at all possibility. Let's withdraw. Let's restructure. Let's talk with the Russians about getting new arms control treaties in place, maybe a new form of conventional forces in Europe treaty. We didn't do the right thing because all of that disenfranchises that pyramid I was telling you about. Responsible arms control, responsible policy disenfranchises this entire structure of political economic power that's based on one thing and one thing only: manufacturing a threat that justifies the expenditure of hundreds of billions of dollars every year to create a solution to a problem that doesn't frickin' exist. And frankly speaking, the solution we create doesn't work. It's all just a giant charade. We build weapons that don't work. F-35 fighter. Articulate to me how that thing works.
$1 trillion. We spent $1 trillion on it, and it crashes every other day.
It won't survive the first week of war.
Yeah.
Won't survive the first week of war. But anyways, you got another question or?
No, I understand you need to wrap up. Thank you for coming on. I appreciate it a lot. We all do.
Yeah, we can definitely reschedule down the road as things happen. But I appreciate. Thank you very much for having me, and it's been a pleasure. These are always good questions, and they're good conversations, and I thank you for giving me the opportunity to participate.
No problem. Thank you for coming on.
Okay, thanks.
Have a good one.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks everybody for watching. We had to wrap up a bit early today. So I think this is the shortest interview I've done with him. But if you like what you saw, like, subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. I'm going to continue to cover the conflict in Ukraine, with future streams. So please like and subscribe. You can follow Scott and I on Telegram. The link is in the description of the video. You can also follow me on Twitter. The link is in the description of the video. Thank you guys for watching. Please like and subscribe. You are all welcome. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day.